This morning we're going to look at the Mosaic Covenant in the book of Deuteronomy. We're going to look at the framing of the Mosaic Covenant in Deuteronomy 5 and 6, at some of the laws that are part of the primary stipulations in the Mosaic Covenant, and finish by talking about the blessings and curses in chapters 28 through 30, especially with reference to the exilic context in which this book was composed. In Deuteronomy 5, Moses convenes the Israelites in the plains of Moab. This is after they have left Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, received the law at Mount Sinai, and then wandered in the wilderness for an entire generation. Now everyone has died who was part of that original Exodus group, except for Moses and Joshua. Moses convenes everyone in the plains of Moab. He is not going to be accompanying them into the promised land, but Joshua is. So this is his last valedictory address, his last attempt to tell them the story of where they've been and where they're going. It reminds me of when you were being dropped off in college as a freshman, did your parents give you one last speech? It's like, okay, here's what I want you to remember in this year. This is my last chance to give it to you before you are now out of the house and out of my influence. That's the kind of address that Moses is giving here in the book of Deuteronomy. It's called Deuteronomy, means second law. In other words, it is the second time the law has been presented. It is not identical to the first law, which was at Sinai itself in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, but it is definitely based on it, and there's some interesting parallels. So Moses has gathered the Israelites together, and he tells them an interesting thing. He says that God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Now, the word Horeb here is the Deuteronomy word for Sinai. When you see Horeb, you got to think Sinai. He says something that's literally not true, but that is theologically true. And let me explain what I mean. Moses says, "Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us who are all of us here alive today." In the Hebrew, there are like five words for us here today. I can show you here in the Hebrew. He says, this is in verse 3, he says, "Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but Itanu anachnu ele fo hayom kulanu chayim." With us, we, those who are here today, all of us, alive. So the point that Moses is making is, he says, look, it's not with your parents and your grandparents that God made the covenant at Sinai, but with those of us who are here alive right now. Those of you who are listening to me right now, that's the people who God made the covenant with. Literally, not true. These people were not present for the Exodus, were not present for the revelation of God's law at Sinai. So what's up with this? Moses is casting the covenant not in historical time, not in realistic time, but in mythical time. It is a mythical history that becomes the narrative frame for the covenant, in which past and present and future are all fused together. So the Israelites are gathered here in the plains of Moab, just outside the promised land, and Moses says to them, "Not with our ancestors did God make the covenant, but with those of us who are here alive today." And as we're going to see, that affirmation applies not just to those Israelites who are at Horeb or the ones who are in Moab, but to all the succeeding generations of Israelites who participate in the covenant, meaning that if you are an Israelite, wherever you are, even outside the land, then you are recipients of the covenant. It is with you that God made the covenant at Sinai. We'll return to that at the end of the video today. So this is a mythic framing of the covenant in which past, present, and future are fused together. The term that we give to the general theological framework in the book of Deuteronomy is the term Mosaic Covenant, meaning that God is making a covenant and agreement with the Israelites through the person of Moses. Not a covenant with Moses like the Davidic covenant or the Abrahamic covenant, but a covenant through Moses with the Israelites. It is unlike the Abrahamic covenant and unlike the Davidic covenant, which we saw earlier in the semester. It is a conditional covenant. It has several features, and these features are part of a treaty framework that was common in the ancient world, in which a king would make an agreement, a covenant, a treaty with some lesser king. In this case, God is the king, and Israel is the lesser people who are making an agreement with God. The king, the high God, the high king, the powerful party in the treaty promises certain things. And those who are the lesser ones in the treaty also promise certain things and receive certain things as part of this agreement. In our context, God promises to protect and to bless and to prosper Israel, to give her the land and let her remain in the land, and to have a life of fullness and health and well-being and security. Israel, for her part, agrees to obey the laws of God. The term that we use for this is the term stipulations. They promise to obey the stipulations and in return receive God's protection, God's blessing, God's prospering. That's essentially it. And all of the laws in the book of Deuteronomy function as the content of the stipulations. These are the things that God has required them to do. And if they do them, then they will receive the blessings that you find in chapter 28. And if they fail to do them, then they will experience the curses, which is the flip side, the absence of the blessings that are laid out in that book, in that chapter, 28 through 29. And in chapter 30, what we see is that the final curse, the final punishment, is that Israel will be taken from the land and removed to some faraway place, completely having lost all of the blessings that they had received from God, including the land itself. We'll end up there at the end. So the stipulations. What are the fundamental content of the stipulations? The basics, the basic set of rules, of course, is the Ten Commandments. This is found here in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy. Again, a repeat from this text in Exodus, and it's mostly the same with a few differences. I have a chart here that I will show you that shows that there are really 10, 11, 12, maybe 13 commandments, depending on how you order them. The one I'm going to be using is the one that's common to the Reformed Christians, but also with some reference to the Jewish tradition. In the Jewish tradition, the first commandment is, I am the Lord your God. This is the fundamental affirmation. In the Christian tradition, that is seen as a prologue, and the first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. And the second one is, do not make for yourself any image of anything in the form of anything that's in the earth, or in the air, or in the water. Depending on how we divide these up, these two commandments, have no other gods before me, and do not make for yourselves any images to be used in worship. These are the two commandments that make Israelite religion unique and notable in the ancient world. Monotheism, the idea that you would sacrifice, that you would worship only one God. Here, have no other gods before me doesn't necessarily imply monotheism by itself. Have no other gods before me. Maybe there are other gods out there, but we don't worship them. But it is definitely moving in that direction, and it becomes a very important passage for the establishment of the monotheistic tradition. The second one, do not make for yourself an idol. You might think that this is don't have other gods, because we use the word idol to mean other gods. This is a doctrine called aniconism, meaning you're not allowed to use images in the worship of Yahweh, in the worship of the Lord, Don't make a man statue. Don't make an animal statue to represent God. This is what the Israelites had done with the golden calf, and we saw references to this in the history books and also in the prophets. There's another very important passage in the history of monotheism here in Deuteronomy 6:4. This is called the Shema, and it reads in our English translation here, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone." And as you can see in the Hebrew, I can show you that again. Here's the text. "Hear, O Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad." It's just 4 words, no verbs. The Lord, our God, the Lord, one. The Lord our God is one. The Lord is our God only. The Lord is the only God that exists, right? These are all different interpretive possibilities that have been used in the history of Christianity and in the history of Judaism. Let's get back to here we go. So this translation implies sort of what I said for the first commandment a minute ago. The Lord is the only God that we worship. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Worship God. Serve God. Love God. Don't worship any other gods. Maybe they exist, maybe they don't. But as far as you're concerned, they're completely irrelevant. And then keep these words that I'm commanding you today in your heart. At the end of this chapter, here's one of my favorite passages in Deuteronomy. Moses says, when your children ask you, what is the meaning of the law? What is the meaning of the law? You shall say to them, we were slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. He displayed before our eyes all these wonders and signs against Pharaoh. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land that he promised on oath to our ancestors. Then the Lord commanded us to observe these laws, to fear God for our lasting good, so as to keep us alive, as is now the case. If we obey them, then we will be in the right. So what is the meaning of the law? The meaning of the law is that we were slaves in Egypt and God set us free. The meaning of the law is God's universal and unilateral act of deliverance. And secondarily, God then, in a second act of mercy, announces the law, gives people a vision of how to live, articulates to the people through the law how God wants human community to be formed. How does God want us to live together? That is the vision that is found in the law, and it is a gift of God that comes to the people after God has delivered them from their bondage. And if we do those things, then this will be good. We will be in the right. This will keep us alive. These are good things. Now that's a different idea than you might read, for example, in some New Testament passages that talk about the law as something that is a bondage, something that is a taskmaster, something that kills, right? In Deuteronomy, the law is the gift of God, and the meaning of the law is God's unilateral act of deliverance. In chapter 28, we find the blessings and the curses that I mentioned earlier. If you obey the Lord by diligently observing these commandments, then these blessings will come upon you. Blessed will you be in the city, in the field, the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your livestock, etc., the basket and the kneading bowl. Your enemies won't be able to overcome you. God is doing all these amazing things for you, and then you will see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and the Lord will make you abound in prosperity. So these are the blessings: security, abundance, life, prosperity for the nation. These passages are used often inappropriately for individuals. The idea that God wants you to be rich, that is not what this text means or says. But what about if you don't obey? What are the curses? And you see they are the exact opposite. Cursed in the city, cursed in the field, the basket, the kneading bowl, the fruit of the womb. And then the curses are laid out in a little more detail: disaster, panic, frustration, pestilence, fever, inflammation, drought, blight, mildew. The sky is bronze, the earth is iron. People are going to attack you, and defeat you. You will be afflicted with boils and ulcers and scurvy and itch. You will be afflicted with madness and blindness. Just all of you can go read all of these. They're just incredibly rich and violent descriptions of punishment. Why are these punishments here? These things represent the removal of the blessing. This is what happens when Israel throws off the covenant. When they stop fulfilling their stipulations, their obligations, then they no longer receive the thing that God has offered to them. And in the end, ultimately, you will serve your enemies. He will put an iron yoke on your neck, and the Lord will bring a nation far away to come and take you into captivity. This is a description, not specifically, but I think intentionally, a description of the exile. Those who are reading this passage are in exile. And much like we saw with Jeremiah and Ezekiel and some of the other prophets, the question that is being asked is, what are we doing? How do we end up here? Why are we in exile? Is it fair? Has God been defeated, or is God responsible? What does this even mean? And furthermore, is there any hope? And what you see in these chapters, we'll skip ahead a little bit to chapter 30. He says, look, after all these things have happened, you're going to be in a faraway land, even if you are exiled to the ends of the world. From there, the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. All you have to do is return to the Lord, obey him, and then he will restore you to the blessing. He will restore you to the covenant. So, like we saw in the beginning, we have now fused the horizons of past, present, and future. Moses has fused the horizons of Sinai and Moab, and now he's fusing the horizons of Sinai and Moab and Babylon. And that same dynamic works all through history as later generations read this passage. And the idea is that we're in exile, we're in Babylon. What is the covenant? How do we get it? What was the land? Why did we have it? Why did we lose it? And how might we regain it? That is the fundamental question understood in the context of the Mosaic Covenant that is being addressed by the book of Deuteronomy. And in that way, it's very similar to some of the other passages we've already read, most notably the Deuteronomistic history, Joshua through Kings, and some of the prophets, especially the prophet Jeremiah.